They're not scouting, they're seizing. Mark every gate. Full red. Commander Dalenvor's voice broke across the bridge like metal clashing against stone. Even before the full threat profile finished streaming across the laser plasma display, his hand was already motioning for override authorization. The illumination panels above dimmed slightly, reacting to the shift in command protocols, and the crew fell into silence. Sharp, functional silence, the kind that settled into the bones of veterans who had already lived through things that rewrote their instincts. Tau Manera had never mattered until it did. Nestled at the far shoulder of the eastern spiral, the sector had quietly supported Earth's outer colonies with rare trace metals buried deep inside fragmented asteroid rings. 5 jump gates monitored its entry points, their cores stabilized by fusion anchors and policed by autonomous relay stations. For over a decade, nothing had tested their defenses, until every gate flickered out within 4 minutes. Not shut down, flickered, as if something had distorted their continuity rather than breached it. And then came the gravitic shear. Lieutenant Bravik, operating Helm Diagnostics, nearly dropped his input wand when the readings started to warp. Field distortion radius is expanding in a stuttered ring, he muttered. Almost like they're collapsing re-entry time, or masking real positioning. Vor corrected, stepping forward. I want all ghost echoes mapped. Use residual flare frames from the last solar sweep. The overhead speaker crackled again, this time from Orbital Defense Relay Sentry 7. Loss of Gate Theta confirmed. Outer beacon grid has ceased pinging. We have no visual. No contact. Only mass. Too much mass. Give me composition breakdown. Dominion signatures. Zurith capital tonnage, at least 22, over 200 auxiliary displacements, all heading for inner ring. No chatter, no demands, no banners, just movement. Vor's jaw locked. He stared at the data crawling across his tactical console. He didn't blink. The Zurith were not a subtle species. Their ships looked like elongated blades, laced with crystallized armor patterns that refracted sensor readings and confused heat differentials. Efficient? Yes. But it wasn't the design that bothered him. It was their silence. There was no warning message, no symbolic gesture, and, worst of all, no hesitation. Route everything through our black channel buffer, Vor ordered. Shut down active scans. Switch to passive relays only. I want every comm spike logged but never answered. Bravik hesitated. Are we not going to contact High Command? We will, once the timeline confirms. Across the bridge, faint currents of sweat began rising through the recycled air. The temperature had dropped slightly, only by a fraction of a degree, but Vor noticed. The ship was responding to environmental shielding commands in the background, diverting power to sensors and passive stealth layers. Even the machine knew something was closing in. The map zoomed outward. 5 red rings bloomed across the sector view, each marking a disabled gate. Where once there had been secure lanes of trade and mining coordination, now there were only shadows. Vor finally activated his command channel. CommandNet Alpha. This is Interceptor Lead Vor. Confirm full visual drop across Tau Manera. Gravitic breaches logged. Mass confirmed. Hostile. Treaty of Karkal Reach has been violated. He waited for a reply. 3 seconds. Then 5. Only background static. Finally, a low-toned encryption key sounded. The line had routed through an alternate relay farther from the sector. Vor, this is Strategist Hellman, Earth Core Response Grid. We're rerouting reinforcements, but Tau Manera's position places you deep in a corridor choke. You'll hold the outer ring until we arrive. Defensive posture. Minimal escalation. Vor closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the last time he was given the same order. The Battle of Kirell's Rim had cost him 60% of his crew. That day, he'd followed protocol and watched his formation get carved apart by numbers. That was the lesson. The kind no classroom could offer. Sometimes, following orders just means dying in formation. Orders received, Vor replied calmly. One transmission only. Lock the sector. A pause. Vor, confirm that. Did you say lock? He pressed a single key that transferred the recording to Core Command's data vault. Then he leaned in slightly, his voice level but unflinching. Let the math lie. He disconnected before the strategist could reply. Inside the Interceptor's primary hangar bay, ground crews began sealing external modules and applying frequency split coatings to the ship hulls. Each vessel in the 9th group had modifications Vor had insisted on: passive resonance shifters, false signal emitters, and retrofitted defense pods that looked like junked derelicts unless you triggered them in the correct sequence. The crew moved quickly, but without panic. Vor had trained them for this. Not war, but misdirection. The kind of war that eats belief instead of ships. He entered Tactical Room B, where 3 junior commanders awaited. Harkin, a quiet man with hands that always trembled before missions. Jurs, the youngest, whose dry sarcasm often passed for confidence. And Thur, gruff and limping, who'd once walked across a decompressed corridor to close a breached reactor door with his bare hands. You know what I'm about to say, Vor said. Jerez gave a faint smile. You're about to say we're not dying in a straight line today. No, Vor corrected. I'm saying we won't be seen at all. Harkin raised a brow. Scatter maneuver? Beyond that, no patterns, no fleet logic. We vanish, we wait, and we don't talk. Every ship runs autonomous contingency drills, no central orders, no backups, no heroics. They won't be chasing ships, they'll be chasing shadows. Dare coughed once, then nodded. You're betting they'll collapse before we do. Vor didn't answer immediately. He stepped toward the heads-up display, its light painting abstract reflections across his face, and watched as the Zurith fleet's gravitic weight continued to press on the outer rim of the map. Collapse is inevitable, Vor murmured. The question is, who believes it first? A low alert pulse ran through the command deck. Not an alarm, a sync chime. All 12 ships had confirmed independent signal lockdown. A full isolation protocol was in effect. Tau Manera was now silent, but the kind of silence that doesn't last. Vor leaned closer to the display, eyes scanning movement trails already forming like bruises across the sector grid. Tell them nothing, he said quietly, mostly to himself, not even where to aim. And somewhere in the void, beyond broken gates and pulsing hull shadows, the Zurith closed in, unaware that Earth had just vanished in front of them. The black between stars never stayed still, not when it listened. Commander Vor stood alone in the secondary command alcove, not watching the Zurith fleet press deeper, but tracking how quickly it believed it had already won. The primary fleet map was dark now, scrubbed of live data streams. Every Terran vessel had severed shared contact, and the bridge, once awash in kinetic activity, now rested in layered stillness, where each crew member watched only their own sector window, blind to the rest. 12 ships. Each gone. Scattered, not in desperation, but by design. Vor exhaled through his nose and closed his eyes, not in reflection, but in mental mapping. He didn't need real-time visuals. He had walked every corridor, reviewed every thermal bleed, memorized the field's topography over weeks of silent prep. The outer rings of Tau Manera were a scrapyard of old war tech, abandoned supply haulers and dormant fuel silos left over from cold-era orbital drills. Most commanders avoided it for safety. Vor had always seen it differently. Ruins made better weapons than ships, especially when the enemy didn't know they were armed. Report, he said to no one. His words activated a hidden console embedded in the bulkhead. A soft clatter of data storage crystals spinning through mechanical index slots answered him. Old tech. Analog redundancy. The kind the Zurith wouldn't expect. A's crackled through, pre-recorded, rough-edged, familiar. Lieutenant Kazmar, 3 months ago, embedded in the radiation shell of debris field Delta. Site D4 sealed, mines mapped on randomized trigger grids, passive echo beacons calibrated to reflect heat dispersion at staggered delay intervals. You'll need to trigger them like footprints, not pulses. Think predators, not sentries. Vor opened his eyes. The faint, dry smell of synthetic fibers filled the filtered air, a sign the crew had begun suiting into hardened exolayer combat rigs. Every motion in the ship now had weight behind it. His command wasn't to attack. It wasn't even to defend. It was to dismantle the mental scaffolding of the Zerth's confidence. Strip clarity from command, inject doubt into pattern, turn superiority into risk. He slid open the top deck console and keyed in the master contingency sequence. Protocol, Shattergrid. Authorization accepted. Command sync disabled. Tactical logic fragmented. Autonomy status engaged. Somewhere in the sector, the Salvaro's Jurith ship would now be redirecting its core signature through an old TerraCore relay that projected synthetic electromagnetic distortions. It wouldn't fire. It would appear as if it had. The Zerith would log the blast, triangulate direction, and counterstrike nothing. Minutes later, another pulse would echo from a totally different region, seeded from a hidden relay in the dead zone where Thayer had buried old thermonuclear flare pack. It wasn't chaos for the sake of noise. It was noise that looked plausible. The kind of disruption that turned captains against readouts and officers against AI guidance. Meanwhile, in the silent outer belts, the 9th group had scattered into zones others feared to navigate. Harkin's cruiser, the Halavik, ghosted into a hollow reactor field. A drifting scaffold of a power station long shut down, but structurally sound. Its walls were laced with leaded memory alloys that distorted long-range sensors. Inside, his team calibrated percussive lures designed to mimic the sound of evasive propulsion, but on delays. A sound trap. If triggered, it would seem like Terran ships were still dodging fire, but there'd be no target to chase. Even now, the Zerith fleet spread wide in a phalanx shape, casting stabilizers across the lower orbital bands, anchoring for presumed occupation. Their orbital stabilizers sent hydraulic spikes into nearby asteroids, latching onto rings rich in thorium and pressurizing for extraction. They weren't preparing for resistance. They were claiming. Bravik, who had remained silent during most of the scatter, broke protocol and keyed a direct feed to Vor's isolated node. "Sir," he said quietly, "do they not see how wrong this feels?" Vor didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened a data file that listed casualty logs from Kirell's REM. Names, ages, duty titles. Most of them had died not because they were outgunned, but because they were in formation when the Zerith flanked. "They think we're gone," Vor finally replied. "That's the part we've earned. Now we teach them what staying unseen can cost." The Zerith warcruisers began to arc toward what looked like a broken debris string across the equatorial band of Tau Manera. What they didn't know was that Thayer had rigged those fragments with compressed particle mines locked to trigger only on proximity and Zerith IFF codes. Codes Vor had captured during a diplomatic exchange months ago, never deleted, just shelved. The first cruiser slowed, its underbelly casting a faint violet glow as it deployed a stabilization wing. The light touched one of the disguised fragments. 2 seconds later, the sky turned into jagged spirals of vaporized tungsten. The cruiser tilted. Its stabilizers rotated wildly. One tore free. No explosion followed. Just a magnetic pulse that shorted its forward sensor cone. It wasn't destroyed, but it was blind. That was the point. Zerith commanders began to argue in their encrypted open channels. Vor's team couldn't understand the language, but they could see the volume spikes, the overlap, the increased broadcast interruptions. Confusion, not destruction. Across a different quadrant, the Salvaros had ignited a false ignition field. A flare meant to simulate an overloaded reactor core. the type of signal only a Terran battleship in full burn would produce. 3 Zereth auxiliaries moved in instantly. The flare vanished. The ships found nothing. They lingered, scanning the area, engines pulsing to hold balance, while their fleet command barked new grid orders. Rotate formations, locate real threats, increase forward sensor sweeps. But every new order came tangled in its own contradictions. Bohr's ships never stayed still, never fired more than once, never lit the same shadow twice. Somewhere near the ruined Terran satellite chain, Vor keyed one final message to his squad leaders. Encrypted to each man uniquely, broadcast with an 8-minute delay. You know your zones. Trust only what you planted. If a pattern emerges, you're doing it wrong. He sent it, closed the panel, and leaned back in the steel-bolted seat, designed for crash restraint, not comfort. He could still feel the pull in his neck from a shrapnel scar that hadn't healed straight. That battle had taught him the wrong way to survive. This one would teach the enemy the cost of misunderstanding: silence. The Zereth didn't know it yet, but they had entered a battlefield already shaped, one where the war wasn't being fought between ships, but inside every targeting system, between every second of delay, in every assumption they thought was still safe. And they would not know the rules had changed until they tried to play by them, and failed. The first strike didn't resemble an attack. At 3:12 sector time, the Zereth forward fleet received a heat signature flare rising from the central asteroid cluster. Moderate, irregular, marked with Terran kinetic pulse characteristics. Within seconds, 2 auxiliary cruisers broke formation, descending with synchronized pincer vectors to triangulate the anomaly. The signal vanished before they could complete the pass. Then, 50 seconds later, another burst, this one closer to the fuel logistics wing. Same intensity, same fluctuation, no target. But the frequency markers matched Terran launch tags. Captain Vor sat in a sealed compartment aboard the Avenger's wake, his only illumination coming from the reflection of movement tracking overlays bouncing off the polished console. His eyes followed the simulation patterns running on passive delay. Every shift, every echo, every interference point followed the map he had etched weeks ago, not on standard charts, but on physical overlays burned into hardened trace paper in his private quarters. He trusted maps only when they couldn't be altered. "Ping rate is climbing," came the update from Commander Harkin, patching in via his vessel's shadow line, the voice grainy with bandwidth resistance. They are redirecting attention from the mining stabilizers and repositioning the escort wing. "Which side?" Vor asked. "Port angle 19, their blind sector. Exactly where you said they'd ignore the drift echoes." Vor didn't answer. He didn't need to. What followed wasn't coordinated aggression. It was madness, engineered to look like logic breaking down. The Selvaros had deployed its first wave of kinetic decoys. Titanium rods coated in trace carbon, released at staggered intervals and spinning slowly through magnetic trails left by old orbital wreckage. They weren't meant to hit anything, but when launched through the derelict station ring, they struck hollow beams and ancient scaffolding with distinct rhythmic pulses. Each impact sounded like movement, each vibration reflected off the nearby debris, bouncing erratically into Zereth audio sensors. Their tactical suite interpreted these anomalies as propulsion skips. Zereth warships don't ignore repeated anomalies. Their doctrine mandates immediate engagement with any trace-matching enemy propulsion patterns. It took less than 2 minutes for one heavy cruiser to deploy a torpedo. The torpedo never hit anything. It cruised through vapor fields and gas strands until its guidance system, locked on a fake heat signature, brought it dangerously close to a parked fuel ship from the same fleet. With no override issued in time, the torpedo detonated beneath the fuel belly. The flare bloomed like a flashbulb across 10 decks. The cruiser tilted, engines flickering as the shock wave rolled sideways across its stabilizers. Thor saw it all through reflected telemetry, slow, fragmented, distorted by the distance and filtering delay. And still he gave no order. Across another quadrant, Lieutenant Jers activated the final pulse of a reprogrammed orbital drone, an ancient satellite from the Treaty Recon Initiative, stripped of its original function and loaded with feedback relays. It emitted a broadcast at exactly the same frequency as a Zurith command ping. From the enemy's perspective, it sounded like an authenticated directive from their own hierarchy, except the command didn't match any known instruction code. 2 Zurith light frigates responded anyway, scanning for a target that didn't exist, and misread a low thermal flare released by the Helvik. That flare was built to mimic the heat shadow of a stealth recon ship. One of theirs. They fired. One strike landed. The recon vessel dropped from stealth, trailing sparks across its dorsal side, emergency lights blinking erratically. Wrong ship, wrong enemy. Their own. Inside the Avenger's wake, Vor's display now bloomed with red sectors. Not Terran alerts, but Zurith broadcast panics. Interference charts, system mistrusts, AI corruption flags. Internal orders now had to pass through 4 layers of authentication before being approved, every command dragged behind action by 7 to 12 seconds. And 7 seconds was enough. In orbit above Tau Manera's fractured moonlit belt, the Draven Thorn, Earth's oldest destroyer still in service, adjusted course to trigger a passive proximity mine. It had been calibrated months earlier and hadn't responded well to recent radiation storms. Vor knew it wasn't stable. He watched the telemetry as the destroyer entered the trigger zone. An alert chirped, slight deviation in trajectory. The ship dipped, barely visible from its orientation, and grazed the edge of the drift field. Then came the detonation. No broadcast, no beacon. Just a sudden, sharp flash of thermal overload, and the entire forward deck split open like paper. The hull turned as if yawning under stress, then scattered in a wide arc. Emergency bursts fired, but they spiraled without direction. He knew before the reactor cracked. He knew before the radiation spike confirmed it. Crew count, 61. Survivors, undetermined. He logged it manually. He didn't flinch. Loss was accounted for in every variant of Shattergrid. The psychological toll on the Zurith grew more visible by the minute. Internal squad channels layered with error feedbacks. Multiple command ships issuing contradictory orders. Power distribution flickered on several dreadnoughts. Their own AI cores had begun throttling communications, misidentifying Terran ghosts as confirmed strikes. One broadcast stood out. Zurith command ship, Elaroth, Zin, attempting to issue fleet recall to the outer stabilizers. Instead, the message echoed in reverse, the routing error spliced by a counter-signal relay embedded in an abandoned Zurith freighter repurposed by Vor scouts. The message replayed itself in loops, as if mocking its sender. Zurith Combat AI labeled the command channel as corrupted. It auto-muted it. That command ship's orders stopped reaching the fleet. From the ground-side orbital scans, the Zurith now appeared to be chasing shadows, vessels firing at static echoes, drones reacting to flares, cruisers launching countermeasures against nothing. It was a battlefield composed not of enemies, but of errors. Vor tapped a single command into his private node. Initiate branch, cycle 2. His ship's autonomous protocol would now trigger its second tier, random signal cycling and zero return echo pulses, designed to create the illusion of over 15 Terran vessels simultaneously firing. He stood slowly, the motion pressing against his spine in a reminder of old damage. Corell's rim had left that gift. But here, in the chaos unfolding outside, there was no enemy to shoot at. There was only belief collapsing under its own weight. One crewman stepped toward him from the auxiliary console, eyes wide, whispering despite the sealed chamber. "Sir, are we winning?" Vor's answer came low, deliberate. "We're not fighting," he said. "They're unraveling." And outside, Zurith kept firing, again and again, at everything but us. Inside the command cradle of the Avenger's wake, Vor stood motionless. fingers resting on a dormant console that no longer needed his input. Every maneuver had already been prescripted, every trap seeded. Now came the unfolding, the part no one rehearsed. Across the Tau Manera belt, the Zurith warfleet wavered. Their long-span cruisers drifted unevenly, their formations disrupted by continuous wavefront errors. Fire patterns looped against phantom targets, each response contradicting the last. Static overtook many of their tactical relays, feedback bursts from decoy pulses that had no origin, only signatures mimicking Terran systems, or worse, their own. "Run me thermal mapping on their line vessels," Vor murmured. Ravik patched in, slower this time, his voice edged with disbelief. "They're dropping below regulation hull temp, passive cooling to minimize their own sensor bloom. They've started treating their own fleet like a threat. Exactly where we wanted them." The Selvaros had released another volley of synthetic signal clusters, these tuned to Zurith distress frequencies archived from the failed Akari front. Earth had never broadcast on them, but the Dominion had, during one of their bloodiest retreats. The screams in those logs weren't human, but they were desperate, raw, undeniably real. 3 Zurith destroyers turned instantly, sensors locked on the distress call beamed from an old mining hull seeded with resonance chambers. They deployed anchor lances, moved to cover the transmission source, and then entered the perimeter radius of a mine net designed to stay invisible until the third object entered. The explosions didn't echo. They cracked apart the surrounding debris ring like marrow splitting from ancient bone. One destroyer's core shield shorted, releasing a shimmer of pressurized gas that ignited on contact with a micro-fractured reactor bank. The ship folded open and vanished beneath a bloom of ignition static. Harkin's cruiser banked right through the thermal afterglow, leaving no trace but a residual flicker that the Zurith tried and failed to track. They adjusted their rotation algorithms, trying to match the pattern, but no 2 pulses ever aligned twice. The logic never repeated. Every ghost signal told a different lie. On board the Avenger's wake, Vor watched his prey deform. The flagship of the Zurith Spearhead, identified through hull contour and reactor bloom width, launched 6 scout drones in rapid succession. The drones had been designed to pierce distortion fog, models equipped with narrow-beam penetrators and hardened routing cores. They vanished 20 seconds after launch. Not destroyed, absorbed. Those drones had entered the Obereth lattice, a cloud zone Vor had manually stitched together using derelict reactors, plasma husks, and dormant thermal baffles. Their sensory intake was drowned not by attack, but by reflection. The signal paths bounced endlessly, forming false geometries and corrupted telemetry. Zurith Command couldn't trace the losses. They had no point of contact. Just absence. Their forward AI cores began issuing red-line anomaly reports, marking over 300 independent threats. All of them Terran-gagged, none of them real. "Pull feed from Quadrant 6, Vor said. "I want eyes on their leftmost capital ship." The view shifted. The Zurith dreadnought in question, broader than any in the cluster, appeared to stagger in mid-measure, its stabilizers twitching out of alignment. The lateral port had begun venting nitrogen in fits, evidence of overcorrection in its counter-rotation banks. The vessel had registered false proximity warnings. It was now reacting to targets it couldn't locate. Then came the chain event. The dreadnought, attempting to sidestep what it believed was an inbound collision, adjusted its trajectory by 11 degrees. It didn't clear the drift field. Instead, it struck the remains of an abandoned Terran reactor station, a giant carcass left from the Cold Era, still locked in dormant orbit, now tethered to 5 unmanned defense pylons. The dreadnought's forward prongs tore straight through the dead shell. What they didn't know, what Vor had planned, was that the reactor core had never been disabled, just disconnected. Its magnetic shielding had been stripped down and rearmed as a kinetic trigger point. If anything touched it, It wouldn't explode. It would draw power. And when the Zereth ship breached the hull, the old station absorbed its magnetic field in a violent surge. That station flared. Its ancient control nodes collapsed. The tethered pylons, having read the surge as an attack, activated their long-dormant failsafe. They detonated inward, not outward. The blast didn't scatter, it imploded, dragging the dreadnought down into itself like a sinkhole snapping shut. The shockwave shot horizontally across the upper belt, smashing into two support cruisers that had been screening the dreadnought's starboard path. Vor turned slightly as the report came in. Casualties? None on our side, Jeers reported. 3 enemy vessels lost, and their rear guard is folding inward, trying to tighten ranks. That's the worst move they could make. He stepped toward the forward interface, scanning the projected data maps, eyes flicking across each cluster rotation, searching for asymmetry. The Zereth were used to command structure dictating response, but now that structure had turned against itself. As units shifted to regroup, their own communication hierarchy bogged down under counterflag signals. Vor's fleet, what was left of it, continued mimicking command calls using captured Zereth syntax patched into low-bandwidth broadcasts seeded weeks ago into static pylons scattered along known orbit trails. Each broadcast rerouted 3 times, each one slightly corrupted to resemble either an emergency alert or a chain of command override. The Zereth reacted accordingly. At 4:26 sector time, the Dominion flagship issued a final cluster directive. Divide remaining ships into 4 mini-fleets, each to operate independently across separate bands of Tau Manera's orbital curve. Isolation, they believed, would allow each cell to identify threats without interference. It was a fatal choice. Fragmentation made the entire fleet easier to unseat. It removed redundancy. It cut their eyes apart. It left holes in every quadrant. Vor watched the display as the Zereth war machine cracked itself apart to defend against ghosts. Execute scatter realignments, he ordered. Drift on irregular vectors. Echo nothing. Let them talk to themselves. And as the Dominion fleet dissolved into disconnected cells, chasing shadows through debris fields it couldn't map, Earth's ships simply drifted out of sight, leaving behind only questions. The radiation bleed started on Deck 3 of the Hailvik. Barely a flicker at first, then the reactor casing began to warp, its shielding panels rattling under thermal strain they were never designed to handle for so long. Emergency dampers kicked in 5 seconds late. That delay turned manageable heat into structural compromise. Lieutenant Harkin didn't shout. He reached for the override collar at his neck, locked into manual mode, and sealed off the aft compartment himself. The noise wasn't loud. It was a crunch, like rebar snapping under a slow crush. He didn't flinch as the auto-scrubbers kicked in, filtering out particulate vapor now coating his boots in layers that would flake away with time, but not memory. Cooling line 2 is gone, the systems officer muttered behind him. Shield loop can't compensate for the drift anchor's bleed vector. Harkin tapped the console once, fingers sluggish in the heat haze. Dump the reserve cell. We run dark from now on. Don't ask for help, no one's coming. Somewhere beyond the static-washed viewplate, the stars flickered. Not with distance, but interference. And the Hailvik wasn't alone in failure. The Vascarn, deeper into the ash fields, began to overheat its aft array after running its decoy rig nonstop for 47 minutes. That system had been intended for short-term burst signatures, not continuous misdirection. By the time the alarm registered, their reactor shielding was flexing against vent pressure that had nowhere left to go. Vapor flooded their internal nav chamber, shorting out their backup displays. Captain Druin stood inside the narrowing heat corridor and issued his final order through a patchy internal feed. Cycle it back. Let it draw on the flare bank. Don't stop it. Just redirect it into the field and light the zone up behind us. 1 flare before we go. His hands trembled. His voice didn't. Vor received no report from Druon. He didn't expect one. He didn't need it. The detonation registered on his tactical overlay as a circular bloom traced in 3 directions. That told him everything. One final decoy pulse, a detachment order sent through fallback command lines, and a farewell flare timed to scramble Zurith directional pings. It had worked. The Zurith had responded with another overcorrection. The flagship's AI, increasingly mistrustful of incoming feeds, began auto-shutting secondary relays. One by one, its information lifelines collapsed. Without external telemetry, it relied on predictive modeling. But the modeling had been warped by Earth's own feed distortions, scrambled heat maps, misaligned gravity echoes, and the oldest weapon in Vor's arsenal: pattern bleed. The AI saw too many threats, too many vectors. It began assigning false priority status to shadows. One Zurith cruiser spun out of formation, executing a sharp lateral strafe across its squad's perimeter, responding to what its own sensor thought was a Terran barrage. No missiles had been fired. It smashed into its own stealth recon wing and tore both ships apart. Inside the Avenger's wake, Vor sat in silence, staring not at the chaos, but at an old voice log held inside his personal archive. He played it. "Commander, this is Nesson. We've rerouted shield cycling and can hold position another 9. Wait, no, they're coming from the left arc. We need a new heading. Vor, do you?" The voice snapped out. That was Kirell's rim. Nesson had been 19. Vor never issued the counter order. He was still waiting for confirmation from above when the flank collapsed. He closed the log. "I don't issue commands to men I know can die better without them," he said aloud. He didn't know if anyone was listening. Across the field, Terran ships drifted through blind zones, not communicating, not confirming kills, no acknowledgements, no victory declarations, just motion, ghosted through static corridors seeded with purpose. Some pilots had been under blackout protocols for so long the emergency hallucination triggers kicked in, psychological artifacts baked into survival conditioning. One crewman aboard the Tarnid's Reach saw an enemy ship fire from behind a spectral bloom and launched a preemptive salvo. The enemy wasn't there, but the flare was bright enough, loud enough, and wrong enough to draw attention. 3 Zurith gunships turned toward the flare, marked it as Terran signature, and fired. The Tarnid's Reach took 2 direct hits and folded outward into the dust ring. No distress call, no black box ping. Only silence and flicker trails. Zurith internal comms broke down within the hour. Command chains collapsed as their AI began rejecting orders, treating them as corrupted due to repeated misrouting. Internal suspicions spiked. On the Zaruk Delm, a Dominion strike captain shot his own lieutenant during a command handoff. Convinced the subordinate had tampered with the long-range scans, a second officer tried to intervene and was detained in the cryo locker with a disruptor at his spine. They were unraveling, not just technologically, but mentally. Across every quadrant, flickers of light rippled from defense mines still dormant seconds before. False threats triggered real action. Static tension bred real death. Inside the Avenger's wake, Bravik finally spoke. His voice was low, barely audible. "Sir, should we check in with the Hailvik? They haven't." "No," Vor said. "We don't interrupt silence. It's what's guiding them now." He stood, the motion stiff, shoulders set back as if bracing against a pressure that couldn't be measured by mass. "All of them know why they're still out there. It's not because I told them where to be, it's because I didn't." The console dimmed slightly, screen layers folding into standby mode. "Everything out there," Vor said, eyes focused on the drifting Zurith fragments now tearing at their own formations, "is reacting to a fight we never gave them." "Then what do we call this?" Bravik asked. Vor didn't look away from the monitor. "We don't name it. We let them do that. Later, if any of them are still alive." And beyond their ship's blackout shell, dozens of Zurith vessels spun in broken loops. Blind, alone, uncertain, chasing threats their sensors couldn't untangle from memory or fear. The order came without fanfare. Vor keyed in Phase 3 from his sealed console, initiating the final sequence embedded into the 9th Interceptor Group's Black Protocol vault. There was no broadcast, no cue for the fleet. Each Terran vessel carried the phase logic internally, preceded, encrypted, dormant until now. Outside, in the fragile orbits of Tau Manira's outer belt, 100 asteroids, long dormant, structurally unstable, many rigged with micro-thrusters and dormant seismic charges, shifted in calculated succession. The movements were staggered. Some rolled gently, others jolted abruptly, breaking apart from subtle stress lines that had been scored into their surfaces weeks earlier. They didn't explode. They collapsed, cracking into controlled slides that launched clouds of dust and fractured stone across every navigational channel. To a civilian ship, the event would register as geological debris, but to the Zurith it looked like arrival, the prelude to atmospheric rupture, a tactic humans were known to use to mask fleet re-entry. On board the Tarnis Clade, one of the surviving Zurith heavy frigates, the command AI flagged 47 separate trajectory anomalies. It overrode 3 navigation updates in under 4 seconds. 2 officers argued over threat origin while their forward sensors clogged with layered feedback loops. To them, the asteroids looked like braking arcs, the kind used by reinforcement cruisers when bleeding speed upon re-entry. Vor had anticipated the mistake. From the command cradle of the Avenger's wake, he watched the interference fields bloom. Not one of those rocks had a Terran vessel behind it. They were noise, blind spots, heat dumps, shaped confusion launched into a target already cracking under pressure. He turned toward Bravik, who had just finished filtering through 10 Zurith emergency channels in rapid succession. "What's the tone?" Vor asked. "Command threads overlapping," Bravik replied. "One squad's requesting rally. Another just issued a blind retreat marker. They're canceling each other in real time." "And the flagship?" Bravik hesitated, mouth slightly parted. "Shouting down their own AI. They've resorted to analog overrides. It's not holding." "Good," Vor said. "That's when the orders start misfiring." Across the shattered mining rings, one of the central Zurith warships turned sharply. It caught a fragment storm mid-rotation and banked hard to correct course. Its flanking unit, following an outdated evasion protocol, interpreted the change as hostile orientation. 3 pulse torpedoes deployed without hesitation. None were targeted. They simply fired into the same quadrant, just wide enough to scrape the stabilizers off a friendly cruiser. In the confusion, the Belkarn Zur, a command-tier battleship, launched a jamming field wide enough to silence 1,000 clicks of space. The field blanketed not only enemy threats but its own formation. Nearby units went dark, signal flares triggered in panic. One scout vessel veered sideways into a radiation cluster, overcorrected, and snapped its tether line. Within 20 seconds, the warlord aboard the Velkarn Zur initiated a full retreat maneuver. No strategy, no coordination, just escape. The vector it chose ran straight through the orbital range of an old mining satellite, unremarkable at first glance, floating silently beside a rusted cargo hauler coated in dust. But that orbital had been repurposed 3 months ago. Vor had acquired Zurith security tags from an intercepted cargo runner. Those tags had been burned into the satellite's logic kernel and nested beneath layers of ancient defense code. When the Velkarn Zur approached, the satellite recognized the approaching vessel as Internal Threat Condition Level 1, Zurith designation. Its defenses activated without warning. 6 interior turrets extended on stiff mechanical joints, locking into position as their targeting scopes spun open. They didn't aim. They identified. The warlord's vessel tried to veer. The satellite fired. Energy bolts struck across the underbelly, carving deep furrows through armor plating, ripping into the magnetic stabilizers. One bolt found the ship's forward magazine. The secondary detonation bloomed, a sharp vertical geyser of light that rippled against the debris clouds like lightning on a water surface. The warlord's ship didn't drift. It broke into fragments, too small to track. Ravik flinched. Did we log that one? No need, Vor replied. They won't either. From every band around Tau Manera, Zurith vessels now turned sporadically, some retreating toward the gates, others drifting helplessly, systems flooded with incompatible feedback. Orders still came, but none completed. Half-processed commands fought against corrupted subroutines. The same distress call bounced across 3 squadrons in reverse. In the dead middle of it all, Earth's fleet remained silent. Not because of damage, not because of fear, because silence itself had become the weapon. One of Vor's lieutenants, speaking from the Hailvik, finally broke blackout protocol with a single encoded update. Command, Quadrant 5 is turning on itself. Should we press the advance? Vor didn't respond. He stood before the wall-mount data archive, watching decades-old maps flicker beneath a layer of static. Instead, he opened a voice log. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It wasn't for command, not even for the Senate inquiry he knew would come later. It was a time-stamped entry set to record for future reference. 1 sentence. The field is quiet, for now. He closed the panel and walked back toward the central display, where scattered Zurith vessels blinked out, one by one. Some lost to friendly fire. Others consumed by their own paranoia. Vor didn't need to give another command. The sky was already doing it for him. The reinforcement fleet emerged from jump transit in standard combat formation. Forward claws extended, shielding arrays layered in full readiness, weapons armed before their visual feeds stabilized. The navigational corridor spat out 23 Terran warships in tight alignment, each expecting kinetic impacts or intercept trajectories. None came. Rear Admiral Vesic stood on the bridge of the Corin Stride, eyes adjusting to the atmospheric contrast as the glare from Tau Manera's fractured orbital field bled across the viewpanes. Static trails marked every axis. He leaned forward, expecting motion, expecting resistance. Nothing moved. "Where are the Zurith formations?" asked Commander Fennel beside him, tone stiff, more confused than relieved. Vesic didn't answer. His fingers twitched toward the sensor suite, where he watched the wreck maps redraw themselves every 30 seconds as new fragments drifted into scan range. Every update added mass, not structure. It was all debris. No vessels, no pods, no signatures. Only scattered wreckage fields laced with radiation from overlapping detonation shadows. "Begin grid pass. I want full spectrographic sweep," Vesic ordered. "Don't trust the silence. Confirm all positions manually." But the silence wasn't hiding anything. It was the result. The ships fanned out, conducting cautious flyovers. They documented engine cores twisted open like torn fabric, hull plates curled inward, entire frame skeletons hollowed out and pockmarked with impact scoring. None of the Zurith shipwrecks looked like they'd been struck by concentrated fire. Most had collapsed under misalignment stress, triggered by collision or catastrophic systems failure. Several hulls bore unmistakable signs of internal detonation, torpedoes launched from within, not from outside. What stunned the reinforcement crews more than the devastation was its finality. "Not a single beacon," Fennel murmured. "They didn't even try to send a surrender ping." "No capsules either," Vesic added. "No distress logs, no blacklight flares. It's not just that they lost, it's that they left nothing behind." He opened a secured line to Earth Corps Command. The reply was routed through 5 encrypted relays and returned within 12 minutes, shorter than usual. Corps had already submitted a full operational report. The file was light on commentary. There were no orders given after day 1. All tactical maneuvers were handled through autonomous subroutines, timed signal distortion, and pre-planted environmental triggers. There was no formal battle, just a schedule. The casualty report followed. 3 Terran ships lost: Draven Thorn, Vasgarn, and Tarnid's Reach. Crew fatalities totaled 180, with confirmation still pending for scattered life signs on ejected modules. Reinforcement crews located 2 Terran black boxes intact. Both contained nothing but final logs of command silence and internal system decay. Civilians had not escaped untouched. The orbital scatter from the Zurith collapse had slashed through a communication tower above the outer residential colony of Hess Drift. Fragmentation debris impacted the lower orbit arc, splitting 2 transport rings and shredding 5 unarmored agricultural zones. 412 civilian deaths were confirmed. 87 injured. Infrastructure across 3 colonies would remain unstable for months. Public investigation was inevitable. When Vesic arrived at the scene of the Avengers' wake, he found the flagship still intact, floating without any external markers of engagement. It drifted in a cradle of static, power levels low, drive cores idle. Boarding was approved under Black Entry protocols. No salutes, no comms. Vor waited inside the command cradle. He didn't rise when Vesic entered. "I expected the field to be contested," Vesic said after a pause. "I didn't expect it to be uninhabited." Vor didn't look away from the dimmed console. "It wasn't uninhabited 3 days ago. What do I tell command? Tell them the invasion failed. Tell them the 9th completed containment." Vesic took a few slow steps across the chamber, eyes trailing over the dim logs scrolling on the wall. No tactical reports, no alerts, just timestamps of shifts in gravity well readings, thermal pulses, and crew names marked confirmed or unreturned. "You didn't give orders." "I gave the field," Vor replied. "I let them draw their own lines. The Zurith just walked through all of them." "There's going to be backlash," Vesic warned. "We lost 3 ships, civilians were hit, and there's not a single image of Zurith aggression that will satisfy public channels. They'll run an inquiry, they'll ask for reasoning, but they won't ask why it worked." And Vor was right. By the time the Terran Senate convened 3 days later, they had already received the black box logs, radiation patterns, sensor data, and conflict field diagnostics. The conclusion was irrefutable. The Zurith fleet had been annihilated not by force but by absence, misdirection, and self-inflicted collapse. It was a form of warfare the Senate had never sanctioned, because it never required sanction. The casualties were real, the cost was measurable. No medals were issued. No interviews were granted. No press release circulated. The 9th Interceptor Group was reassigned with zero ceremony to a new command tag. Survey Division Theta 4, tasked with mapping and cataloging gravitational anomalies along the Orion fringe. A role beneath their combat designation. A posting outside the public eye. Vor received the update in a sealed packet delivered by courier node. He opened it, read the reassignment notice, then deleted the message. He didn't protest. He didn't inform his crew. They would know when orders changed. That was enough. Bravik approached him one last time in the observation wing, watching a hull technician paint over the old fleet insignia with neutral survey marks. "They won't thank you," Bravik said. Vor stared at the technician, hand moving in slow, steady lines across the hull. "They shouldn't. You stopped a full invasion. You erased an entire fleet. You buried them with strategy." Vor turned from the viewport, shoulders heavy. "I didn't bury them. They did that themselves. I just handed them the shovel." No one recorded that statement. No one needed to. The 9th left orbit that evening. Their ships bore no banners. No one waited at the docks. Their flight path was routed through back-channel corridors never used for ceremonies. Tau Manera fell behind them. There was nothing left to claim. 2 weeks after the final signal faded, the Zurith Dominion held a closed session among its high command. No external observers were allowed. There were no public declarations, no proclamations of loss or defiance. The minutes of that gathering, however, would later leak through a disillusioned fleet analyst who defected to the independent trade channels. Among the notes was a single phrase, buried halfway down a report stamped with internal crisis markings. Tau Menera, incompatible with predictive warfare. That was all the record said. It didn't mention Earth. It didn't explain the decision to retreat from one of the most resource-rich sectors within 3 trade routes of the Dominion supply chain. It didn't acknowledge that 22 capital ships had vanished without striking a single confirmed enemy hull. The Dominion simply withdrew. All operations halted. Entire logistical routes were rerouted around the sector. Doctrine updates followed in whispers. Zurith simulation protocols now included non-linear perception zones, and fleet exercises no longer allowed pattern repetition beyond 3 intervals. Their combat AI cores were stripped of direct targeting priority and rebuilt around layered uncertainty filters. But nothing changed the fact that their fleet officers had no language for what had happened, because Earth had never officially arrived. Back home, Earth's Command Council didn't celebrate. Public coverage was minimal, a footnote in a mid-sectal legislative report. The phrase, successfully neutralized threat activity in Tau Menera, was buried under budget amendments and mining rights extensions. Analysts could not explain what had occurred in a way that comforted civilian channels. The war was never declared. The enemy was never confronted, and yet the outcome could not be contested. The colonial networks across the Outer Rim filled the void with their own explanations. Nobody had seen live footage. There were no broadcast feeds, no fleet formation videos, no intercepted communiques. Just silence and wreckage, and a sector that no longer responded to standard diplomatic queries. One phrase began to take root, passed from station to station, repeated with different voices but always with the same uneasy respect. The Terrans didn't win with fire, they won by vanishing. Vore didn't comment on the rumors, he didn't speak to the press. When the Senate requested a follow-up appearance from the 9th Interceptor Group, the request was rerouted through logistics, then forgotten. Survey Division Theta 4, their new assignment, was too far from broadcast relay points and too boring to prioritize politically. Weeks later, long after the field had gone cold, Vore returned to Tau Menera aboard a single-vessel reconnaissance transport. He made no formal request. The clearance codes were buried in an old operations chain he'd never officially resigned from. The transit left without an escort, and nobody met him upon arrival. He stood alone at the command viewport as the transport adjusted orbit above the debris ring. The wreckage hadn't drifted far. Fractured hulls still spun slowly in place, the trails of past collisions etched in the darkness like frozen waves. Vapor streaks from scorched stabilizers painted quiet arcs through sensor range. Vore didn't record anything. He didn't transmit a statement. He simply stared. Behind him, the pilot, a technician on temporary rotation, broke the silence. They say the Zurith can't make sense of it. Their logs don't line up. They keep trying to find how we pulled it off. They're asking the wrong question, Vore said. The pilot shifted in place. Then what's the right one? How do you defeat a force that never defines itself? How do you kill what won't show up the way you expect it to? He stepped closer to the viewport, as if proximity might reveal something the recordings couldn't. There's nothing left to aim at, the pilot said after a pause. We didn't give them a target. Vore finally turned to face him. We gave them too many, until they fired at all of them, including themselves. The pilot swallowed. They won't come back, will they? Vore didn't blink. They won't know how. The transport's internal clock chirped softly. Orbit alignment complete. Departure window in 8 minutes. Vore walked past the pilot and into the auxiliary cabin. He sat at the back, activated the local log interface, and opened a personal entry. He didn't annotate. He didn't attach tactical data, just a single voice line. If they return, we'll give them nothing to aim at again. He closed the terminal, stood up, and returned to the viewing panel one last time. No more ships drifted. No enemy signals flashed. The sector had gone quiet. Not by diplomacy, not by overwhelming destruction, but because memory now shaped its borders more than law ever could. Tau Manera remained unclaimed, not from peace, but from what had been left behind. Earth didn't expand territory, no new stations were built, there were no monuments, just a drifting field of fractured decisions and shattered predictability. And somewhere, across distant systems, when enemies of Earth gathered to plan around Terran movement, they left a sector marked blank, not due to terrain, not because of treaty, because what happened in Tau Manera couldn't be studied. It had to be survived, and no one who entered that field had. If an entire fleet can be destroyed without a single direct order, what does that say about the species who did it? Hit the subscribe button for more thrilling HFY stories that rewrite the rules of war.